What we're going to do now is take a look at how various people have looked at myth throughout the ages, both from ancient Greece through to the present day. Two of the first individuals that we see in ancient Greece are Homer and Hesiod. The reason that I talk about Homer and Hesiod, the authors of the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Homeric hymns, and the author of the Theogony and Works and Days, respectively, is because these were the first people in ancient Greece to take oral traditions that had already existed for centuries and write them down, in this case as poetry. This is the very beginnings of what we see as the tradition of taking oral traditions and writing them down into a single cemented version. Please note that although these myths written down by Homer and Hesiod are sort of the quote-unquote official versions of these myths, several versions existed as oral traditions both before and simultaneously to the creation of these poems. Think of the oral traditions as a series of videos that are all being recorded all over Greece all at the same time. Homer's Odyssey, on the other hand, is more like just one of those videos, or even just a snapshot from one of those videos, as it doesn't cover the entirety of the Trojan mythical tradition, but instead rather covers only one story, the story of the journeys of Odysseus. Now, Homer and Hesiod also looked at myth in an interesting way. There are two different words that the Greeks used to describe the word myth. They were mythos, a sacred story, and logos, or an ordinary story. These words that were written down by Homer and Hesiod were considered by them to be sacred stories passed down from generation to generation, involving heroes and the gods and sacred ideas and beliefs that are central to the Greek way of life. Whereas a logos might be an ordinary story, an anecdote, a joke, etc. Although they might be transmitted in similar ways, they're not nearly as important to culture as myths are. Now, not all people from ancient Greece believed in the sacredness of myths. The Sophists, a group of philosophers from ancient Athens, taught rhetoric, or public speaking, to the young men of ancient Athens, and as a form of exercise of rhetoric, taught them to argue against the validity of myths. This then taught, the Sophists then taught that mythos, or sacred stories, were not nearly as important as logos, or ordinary stories, because the ordinary word, or logos, could convince people to your point of view, whereas mythoi, or sacred stories, only showed pre-existing belief systems. Another group of people who came out and looked at myth in a different way were the Euhemerist school. The people of the Euhemerist school were a group of philosophers who were the followers of an individual named Euhemeros. This was a man who believed that myths were not true per se, but rather contained an essential kernel of truth. This is an intrinsically ethnocentric point of view for mythology. Essentially, the Euhemerists believed that rather than being objectively true, myths were either primitive explanations of the natural world or time-distorted accounts of real historical events. For example, if it's thundering and lightning out, there's a scientific explanation for that. But because people could not explain why it was happening, they instead said that Zeus was angry. Oh, I'm sorry. Your brother got lost in a shipwreck at sea? He must have angered Poseidon somehow. So this way of looking at the world as a way of, or looking at mythology as a way of explaining natural phenomena that could not yet be explained by science, is not a new idea. It's one that's been expressed by the euhemerists since time immemorial. The other part of the euhemerist idea is that myths act as time-distorted accounts of real historical events. Remember that I told you that myths are oral traditions? Well, they begin out as one story, and just like what would be called fish stories or tall tales, they're very often expanded upon and elaborated on over time. We see this happen in our own culture as well. Are you familiar with the story of George Washington and the cherry tree? It never happened. It started as a moral allegory or folktale and eventually was entered into the public consciousness as something that people believed was true. So this is the basic idea of the point of view of the euhemerist school. The last thing I want to talk about with regards to ancient Greece is a concept that's found across multiple mythologies and multiple world traditions, the idea of the Golden Age. Hesiod, in his Theogony and Works and Days, writes about how when the gods first created mankind, they made human beings out of gold. These human beings lived side by side with the gods, eating ambrosia and drinking nectar on Mount Olympus, until eventually mankind sinned, and Zeus wiped them all out, replacing them with men of silver. When the men of silver sinned, they were replaced by men of bronze, and when the men of bronze had sinned, then they were replaced by men of iron, which is who we are today. These men of iron did not live in close proximity to the gods or have any special powers. They were instead cast out from paradise and set to live on their own and support themselves. This central idea that human beings used to live in harmony with the gods, but then sinned or were cast out, is found in multiple world religions. Native American myth, Chinese mythology, and yes, of course, Judeo-Christian mythology in the form of the story of Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden. This is an important myth theme, or mythological theme, that's found across multiple cultures and multiple time periods. From here, we're going to flash forward to the 19th century. One of the foundational ideas of anthropology as a discipline is that we try to focus on cultural relativism, the idea that all cultures should be treated as equally valid to one another. However, this concept was not present when anthropology first became a discipline in the 19th century. Instead, early approaches to mythology were very ethnocentric and sometimes had incredibly racist or nationalistic ideals attached to them. One such ideal was expressed in the Folkish school. The Folkish school was a theory developed by a German ethnologist by the name of Johann Gottfried Herder. His basic idea was that the stories of the common folk, as he called them, in German that would be spelled not F-O-L-K, but V-O-L-K, that these stories of the common folk, as documented in volumes such as Grimm's fairy tales, were just as important as the forms of art being created by highborn individuals or artists that had patrons who were highborn individuals. This is where we get ideas for things such as folk music or folk tales or folklore. All of these are examples of the work of the folk as developed by Johann Gottfried Herder. However, this idea also became corrupted over time. Essentially, what happened is this theory developed into the idea that there was an original version of mythology, and that people who maintained, whether they be people or folk, who maintained their cultural traditions and kept them most pure over time, were in fact a superior people. This is a very ethnocentric idea. And it's no great surprise then that this idea of the folkish school, as it moved through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, became the foundation for a lot of the racist and anti-Semitic ideologies of the Nazis and other fascist parties of the early 20th century. After all, fascism is essentially the idea, fascism and nationalism are essentially ethnocentric ideas. The Folker School was also founded in a basic idea called comparative mythology. Early anthropologists thought that if myth is an oral tradition, then there was one original creator to the story. And as these stories spread from person to person and culture to culture and generation to generation, they became corrupted over time and changed over time. This basic idea is called diffusion. The idea that cultural traits, products, stories, and myths are passed down from person to person, generation to generation, and culture to culture over time, but have one original creator. However, most anthropologists now agree that this was a false assumption, and that comparative mythologists who like to compare different versions of myths to try to find the quote-unquote original one, based it on the idea that there was in fact an original version and that everything was passed through diffusion. Many modern anthropologists believe that while many myths could have been passed down through diffusion, they could also be passed down through polygenesis, also called independent invention. Polygenesis, or independent invention, is the idea that the same or similar stories can be created independently of one another, usually through similar environments. Let me give you an example. Tell me if you've heard this story before. The gods are angry, so they send down a great flood to wipe out all of mankind, except for one man and his family who are pure of heart. They command this man to build a giant boat in which themselves and a number of animals enter, and together they survive the flood and repopulate the earth. I'm going to pause for a moment so that you guys can think about where you've heard the story before. I know that some of you are saying that this is the story of Noah, but in fact it's also the story of Deucalion and Pyrrha from ancient Greece, and the story of Utnapishtim from ancient Babylonia. Similar stories and myths have also been found in Native American mythology, Chinese mythology, Indian mythology, and African mythology, and all over the world. Does this mean that there was one original version of this particular myth that spread throughout the entire world over time? Not really. One thing that we do know is that human beings began their lives as hunter-gatherers. Their subsistence strategy was to collect pre-existing food sources in the form of plants and animals. Over time, however, human beings learned to domesticate plants and animals and invent farming. And what does farming require? That's right, irrigation. And irrigation requires rivers. And what do rivers do? That's right, they flood and wipe out entire communities. So it's no great surprise then that this particular story, or similar stories to it, emerged in locations around the same time period where farming was first developed and irrigation systems were first developed. So never assume that just because you hear two similar versions or two different versions of the same myth, or that you hear two different myths and that they're so similar that they're different versions of the same myth, they might in fact have been independently invented of one another. Another 19th century way of looking at mythology is the nature school. And this is similar to, but should be very carefully distinguished from, the euhemerist school. The nature school is the belief that all myths have an environmental origin. Someone of the nature school in the 19th century may have said, well, all myths are about the sun, or all myths are about the earth, or all myths are about rain. The idea that myths have an environmental cause, in and of itself, is part of the nature school. Unlike euhemerism, it is not about creating primitive explanations for natural phenomena, but just saying that all myths have their roots in natural phenomena in some way. Everything in anthropology changed in the early 20th century, particularly with the work of Sir James George Frazer. The founder of the English anthropological school, he was the first one to set aside the ethnocentrism of earlier approaches to anthropology, and the first one to take a functionalist approach. In other words, to ask why myths existed, how they behaved in the way they did, and what was the function of myths in human cultures. He was the first to treat Christianity as a mythology, no different from the myths of ancient Greece, or the ones of Hinduism, or Islam, or ancient China, or from any other religion. He was also one of the first to debate the function of mythology. From James George Frazer's point of view, mythology and religion were one and the same. This is where anthropologists get our modern definition of myths: sacred stories central to the belief system and values of a given people, culture, or religion. Because Sir James George Frazer equated myth and religion as being the same thing, we can look at religions as a series of myths or mythologies put together into one comprehensive cultural group. A subset of the English anthropological school is the myth and ritual school. The myth and ritual school is the belief that myths don't just function as part of a religious corpus, but instead also act as blueprints for religious rituals. For example, think of the religious ritual, the Christian religious ritual of communion, eating the bread and drinking the wine in remembrance of the sacrifice of Jesus. This relates back to the myth of the Last Supper from the Bible. Similar examples can also be found in other cultures. In ancient Greece, common practice was to sacrifice an animal, usually a bull or a pig or some other animal, and to divide the animal's butchery up into two parts: the meat on one end, and the fat, bones, gristle, and other parts of the animal on the other. The edible parts would be eaten by parishioners, and the inedible parts would be burned on the altar as a sacrifice to Zeus. This has its foundations in the myth of Prometheus. In ancient Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan, one of the earlier generation of gods, and he liked human beings more than he liked the gods. After stealing fire from the gods and giving it to human beings, Zeus decreed that if human beings must have fire, they must use it to make sacrifices to him, and commanded Prometheus to divide up an animal into two parts. Zeus would choose the part which he liked the best, and that would be burned as a sacrifice to him, and the rest would be left for humans. Because Prometheus liked humans better, he made the meat and the consumable parts of the animal look unappetizing, while taking the bones, gristle, and other inedible parts of the animal and wrapping it up in an attractive layer of rendered fat. When Zeus chose the more attractive looking package, that reflects the idea of the ritual of ancient Greece: sacrifice an animal, eat the edible parts, and sacrifice the rest and burn the rest as on the altar to Zeus. This was the English anthropological school. Another school of thought that we see emerging in the 20th century is the psychological school. The psychological school is founded in the idea that myths can tell us a way that human beings behave, the way they think, and the way their minds work. The foundation of the psychological school lay in the work of two distinct psychologists: Sigmund Freud, the founder of modern psychotherapy, and Carl Jung. Sigmund Freud believed that the mind could be divided into conscious and unconscious levels, and that myths and dreams were essentially the same things. There are ways in which human beings could interpret the workings of the unconscious mind and display them and produce them for use by the conscious mind. Carl Jung's ideas were very, very similar, except he believed in something called the collective unconscious. Does this mean that unconsciously we're all connected on some sort of psychic level? No, of course not. Rather, Jung believed that all human beings have similar drives, impulses, needs, wants, and fears. He called these things archetypes. These archetypes, posited Jung, exist in every human being's unconscious mind, and all human beings have all archetypes. However, the way we express these archetypes are different according to each individual human being, but also according to one culture. So, for example, the archetype of the hero, to me, may be Indiana Jones, or a police officer or firefighter rushing into a burning building to save an individual. To an ancient Greek, their eternal image, their view of the archetype of the hero, may have been Achilles, or Odysseus, or Perseus, valiantly fighting against the Medusa. Likewise, the shadow or darker impulses of the human psyche may be represented by us, by criminals that we see on the news, or the acts of evil individuals, such as dictators and foreign potentates, or they may be expressed mythologically through bad guys such as the evil King Eurystheus, monsters such as the Medusa and the Minotaur, or entities such as the devil or Satan. You get what I'm getting at here. Each of us have these embedded archetypes, and each of us express them in different ways. To Carl Jung, these archetypes are again found in every person and in every culture, but it is how we express it and how we express them that define us. Our next 20th century mythologist that we're going to look at is Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was by far the most prominent mythologist of the 20th century. Joseph Campbell believed that all myths are rooted in the same structure, which he referred to as the monomyth. Joseph Campbell's monomyth theory stated that all myths were about the journey of the hero. It was all about an individual who left their home, went through some form of initiation, trials, quest, and then returned home a hero, an upgraded individual. What might be some examples of the modern monomyth? Well, ancient monomyths might include things such as the story of Hercules. Many of you are familiar with the story from, say, Disney's Hercules, but the ancient Greek myth is actually quite different. Hercules was the son of Zeus, an immortal woman. This earned him the enmity and hatred of Zeus's wife, Hera. So she sent serpents to his crib when he was just a baby to kill him, but Hercules valiantly strangled the serpents. Later on in life, when Hercules was married with a wife and children, Hera sent a madness upon Hercules, causing him to go mad, and in this madness he slew his own wife and children. Hercules' life as he knew it was sundered and separated from what he knew before. This is the moment of separation where the hero leaves the life that he knew. The next step is initiation. In his initiation, Hercules sold himself into slavery to the evil King Eurystheus, who forced him to perform 12 labors, which he thought to be impossible, so that he could keep Hercules in slavery forever. However, Hercules, with the help of the goddess Athena, was able to complete all of these tasks, and in so doing was able to learn that the madness was not his fault, but was sent upon him by the goddess Hera. Eventually, Hercules was able to free himself from the grasp of Eurystheus and return home and find happiness once again. Another example of the monomyth may be found in Hindu mythology. In the story of the Bhagavad Gita, there was a warrior prince by the name of Arjuna. Arjuna was engaged in a civil war against an evil cult called the Sons of Dhritarashtra. When he went out to the battlefield to fight against this cult, because this was a civil war, he saw that this cult had seduced his friends, family members, priests, and teachers in battle against him. In despair over killing people to whom he was devoted and whom he loved, he threw down his bow and arrow in despair. Luckily, his chariot driver was the god Krishna. So even though Arjuna had begun the process of separation by refusing to fight, Arjuna then began the process of initiation, teaching him what it means to be a good Hindu, and teaching him that he must fight the battle against this evil cult, or all will be lost. Arjuna successfully eventually fights the battle and ushers in a 100-year reign of peace. There are also modern examples of the modern-day monomyth. One from my youth might say be the journey of Luke Skywalker from Star Wars. In Separation, in the first Star Wars movie, Star Troopers kill his aunt and uncle. He is brought under the tutelage of Obi-Wan Kenobi and must go through initiation and training under Obi-Wan Kenobi and then eventually also under Yoda. Eventually, he achieves the process of becoming a Jedi and is upgraded to hero status. We see this again and again in popular culture. In The Hunger Games, does Katniss Everdeen leave the life that she knew before? Yes, she gets on a train to the capital. Does she have a helper, someone to help her through the process of initiation and part of her quest? Yes, she has Haymitch. The same could be said of Frodo from Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter from the Harry Potter series, and any number of modern hero stories. As such, we can see why the work of Joseph Campbell is so seminal and so important to the study of modern mythology. Our last mythologist of the 20th century that we're going to look at is Claude Levi-Strauss. Claude Levi-Strauss was the founder of the structuralist school of mythology, otherwise known as structuralism. Claude Levi-Strauss wanted to look beyond the classic elements of mythology and instead look at the underlying structures of human culture. He divided human culture into various groups, which he called codes. And in each of these codes were a series of opposing forces, which he called binary oppositions. Strauss posited that by looking at these binary oppositions and relating them to existing myths, we could figure out the underlying structure of myths and look at how cultures are both similar and different to others. Here are some examples of some binary oppositions or binary opposites. Good versus evil, black versus white, boy versus girl, peace versus war, and more and more. Let's see how these binary oppositions might work in, say, the story of Adam and Eve from the Bible. In the story of Adam and Eve from the Bible, Adam is created out of the dust of the ground, and God creates Eve, his companion, from Adam's rib. They are instructed that they can eat from anywhere in the garden except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But instead, a serpent deceives Eve and tricks her into eating from the forbidden tree. And she in turn tempts Adam to eat. When they are confronted by God, they are then cast out from the Garden of Eden by their sin. So, what are some examples of binary oppositions that we might see in this story? Good versus evil. God is considered good, and obeying him is considered good, whereas the serpent, Satan, is considered evil. Boy versus girl, or man versus woman. The fact that Eve tempted Adam was long used as an excuse for various patriarchal or male-dominated structures in Jewish, Christian, and Islamic mythology. In fact, in the book of Genesis, it actually states of the relationship between Adam and Eve that Eve's desire shall be for her husband, and he shall rule over her. This is a decidedly male-dominated aspect to biblical culture. Other aspects that we might see of binary oppositions include man versus nature. In the book of Genesis, they set up man's relationship with nature as essentially an oppositional force. God even mentions that he created man to rule over all of the other plants and animals of the world. Consider how this contrasts with, say, Native American mythology, in which animals are created first and are actually considered to be greater beings than humans.